She asked me to be her maid of honor on a Sunday afternoon in April, over brunch at the place on Harbor Street where we had been going since we were 22 years old. She slid the ring across the table toward me first, a round solitaire, simple and beautiful, and I said what you say when your best friend shows you an engagement ring, which is that it was perfect and that I was so happy for her and that of course I would be her maid of honor. Of course, there was no question. She was beaming in the way I had not seen her beam in years, a happiness that seemed to come from somewhere deep rather than the surface, and I matched her energy completely because she was my best friend and her happiness was something I had been invested in for 13 years. She told me his name was David. She said he was wonderful. She said I would love him when I met him. She had been keeping him somewhat private, she said, because she wanted to be sure before she introduced him to people who mattered, and now she was sure. I told her I was so glad she had found someone who made her feel that way. I meant every word. I had no reason not to. My name is Lauren Pierce, and I had been best friends with Cassie Marsh since we were 19 years old, since the first week of university when we were placed in the same seminar group and discovered within 40 minutes that we had the same taste in books and the same opinion about a particular professor who took himself too seriously and the same habit of arriving exactly 1 minute before anything started rather than early or late. 13 years is a long time to know someone. It is long enough to have been present for every major event in each other's lives, to know each other's patterns and fears and the specific face each other makes when something is wrong but she is not ready to say so. It is long enough to believe, with the particular confidence of someone who has accumulated years of evidence, that you know a person completely. I had that confidence about Cassie. It was one of the things I trusted most. I had been married to a man named Michael for 4 years, and I had been divorced from him for 2. The marriage had ended for reasons that were painful but not dramatic. We had grown into people who wanted different things, which sounds gentler than it felt from the inside but was accurate, and the divorce was handled by 2 people who had the decency to be sad about what wasn't working without making it into a war. Cassie had been there for every stage of it, the last year of the marriage when I had started to understand it was ending, the months of the divorce itself, the 2 years after when I was rebuilding my life with the particular slow stubbornness of someone who has lost the future she had planned and is constructing a new one piece by piece. She had sat across from me in this exact restaurant dozens of times during those 2 years, listening, asking the right questions, never rushing me toward being more okay than I was. She had been exactly what a best friend is supposed to be during the hardest stretch of my adult life. I had been grateful for her in a way I told her directly, because I believed in saying those things out loud rather than assuming people knew. Michael and I had not stayed in contact after the divorce. Not out of hostility, there was none, but because we had agreed, without making it a formal rule, that the kindest thing we could do for each other was to allow a clean separation. We had no children, no shared property that required ongoing management, no mutual obligations that would have kept us in each other's orbit. He had moved to a different part of the city. We had gradually migrated into completely separate social worlds, the way people do when they are willing to let something go entirely. I did not know where he was living. I did not follow him on social media. I had processed the end of the marriage and the end of the life I had thought I was going to have, and I had arrived, 2 years later, at something that felt genuinely like peace rather than the performed version of it. I thought about him sometimes, with the moderate warmth and moderate sadness that I think is the appropriate relationship with someone you loved and parted from without malice. That was all. Cassie had met him, of course, she had been my maid of honor when we married, and she had been part of our social circle in the early years of the marriage, and she had known Michael the way you know the husband of your best friend. Peripheral. Present at events. Someone you have a comfortable relationship with because the woman you love loves him. When the marriage ended, I had not thought much about what that meant for Cassie's relationship with Michael, because it had not occurred to me that it was a relationship that required thinking about. They were connected through me, and when the connection between Michael and me ended, I assumed the other connection ended too. That is the assumption I am still, 2 years later, working through the implications of. The wedding was in June. Cassie had planned it in 4 months, which was fast but not unusually so for someone who, like me, had an organizational instinct that tended to accelerate when she was excited about something. I had been involved in the planning in the ways that maids of honor are involved: venue visits, dress fittings, the bachelorette weekend in a rented house by the coast where we stayed up too late and talked about everything except, I now understand, the one thing that would have changed the entire context of the weekend. I had not yet met David. Each time I had been about to, a dinner, a casual gathering, a Sunday she had mentioned him attending, something had come up on his end. Work, a family obligation, a schedule conflict. I had not found this suspicious because Cassie was not a suspicious person and the explanations were always plausible, and I was busy with my own life and my own plans and had no reason to be paying attention to the gap between the meetings she promised and the meetings that happened. I arrived at the church 40 minutes before the ceremony, as maid of honor, to help Cassie with the final preparations. I went directly to the bridal room, where she was being seen to by the makeup artist and her 2 bridesmaids, and I focused entirely on her for the next 30 minutes, her dress, her flowers, the small logistical things that needed coordinating before the ceremony began. She looked beautiful in the specific way of someone who is completely certain about what they are doing, which is a different beauty from ordinary happiness and more lasting. I hugged her carefully so as not to disturb anything and told her she was stunning, and she laughed and grabbed my hand and said, "I'm so glad you're here." The ceremony began at 2 o'clock. I walked down the aisle with the other bridesmaids, taking my place at the front of the church, and I looked toward the altar where the groom was standing with his back to the congregation, and I had one full second of ordinary bridal party contentment before he turned to watch Cassie come in and I saw his face. I want to be precise about what happened in my body in that moment, because I think precision is important. There was no single large thing. There was a sequence of very small things, each taking a fraction of a second, each arriving before my mind had finished processing the previous one. Recognition. Confusion, the kind that precedes understanding rather than following it, the confusion of something that does not fit the context. Then understanding, the specific click of the pieces arriving in the right order. And then something that I did not have a name for in the moment, something that was not quite any of the emotions I would have predicted, not rage, not grief, not even shock in the conventional sense, but a strange, cold clarity, the feeling of a room becoming very still. Michael. My ex-husband. Standing at the altar in a gray suit, looking at my best friend walking toward him down the aisle of a church I was standing in as her maid of honor. I stood at the front of that church for the entire ceremony. I do not know how. I know that I held my flowers and I faced forward and I managed my expression with the particular effort of someone who has decided that the alternative is not available. I watched Cassie walk toward him and I watched his face when he saw her, and I watched them exchange vows with the specific presence of 2 people who mean what they are saying, and I stood there and I was still. The reception was at a garden venue 20 minutes from the church. I went. I sat at the head table. I gave a speech that I had written 2 weeks earlier, standing at the microphone in a garden full of people who had no idea what I was managing, and I said the true things I had prepared, that Cassie was someone I had loved for 13 years, that her happiness had always mattered to me, that I wished her everything she deserved, and I did not look at Michael while I said them, and when I sat down I excused myself to the bathroom and stood at the sink and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. I left at 8 o'clock, before the dancing. I said I wasn't feeling well, which was true in every sense that mattered. Cassie hugged me at the door and looked at me, and I watched her face do something complicated, a flicker of something that was not quite guilt and not quite relief, the look of someone who has been anticipating a moment and is now in it and is not sure which of the things she prepared for it was the right one. I held the hug. I said I loved her. I meant it. And I left. She called the following morning. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was 7 minutes long, which I listened to in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store because I had not trusted myself to listen to it at home where there was no particular reason to maintain composure. She explained. Not apologetically, exactly. Cassie was never a person who apologized in the conventional sense because she believed the explanation was more useful than the regret, which I had always found somewhat admirable and found, listening to that voicemail, somewhat infuriating. She said it had started 8 months ago. She said she had struggled with it from the beginning because of me, because of our friendship, because she understood what it would mean if I knew. She said she had tried to end it twice and found she couldn't. She said she had told herself, in the months of the engagement and the wedding planning and the bachelorette weekend, that she would tell me before the wedding, and then each time the opportunity arrived she had found she was too afraid of losing me to take it, and had convinced herself that I would understand better once I saw how happy she was. I sat in that parking lot for a very long time after the voicemail ended. I called her back 4 days later, because 4 days was how long it took me to understand what I actually felt, which was more complicated than what I had expected. What I had expected to feel was betrayal and anger, and those were present, but underneath them was something I had not anticipated, a grief that was specifically for the friendship, separate from anything to do with Michael, which told me something important about where my feelings actually lived. I was not heartbroken about Michael. The divorce had done that work 2 years earlier and it was finished. What I was heartbroken about was 13 years of Cassie, of the specific intimacy of a friendship that had been built across 2 decades of each other's lives, of the Sunday brunches and the bachelorette house and the 7-minute voicemail and the fact that she had sat across from me for 8 months in this restaurant while she was building a life she knew she was going to have to tell me about eventually, and had not told me, and had decided that her own fear of the conversation was more important than my right to have it. When she answered, I let her speak first. She said my name and then she waited, and I could hear in the waiting how much she needed me to say something that would tell her how this was going to go. I did not give her that quickly. I said, tell me when it started. Not the version where it started 8 months ago. The actual version. There was a pause. Then she said, about 1.5 years ago. Which meant it had started 6 months after my divorce was finalized. Which meant there were 6 months of our friendship, of the lunches and the phone calls and the sitting together while I rebuilt, that were clean. And then 1.5 years of something else running underneath. I told her what I needed to tell her, which was not screamed or performed but which was the truest thing I had said to her in 1.5 years of conversations that, on her side at least, had been conducted while holding something back. I told her that I did not wish her and Michael unhappiness. I told her that the marriage was over and Michael was his own person and she was her own person and I had no claim on either of them. I told her that none of that was the point. The point was that she had watched me cry about my divorce and process my marriage and rebuild my life for 18 months, and during all of it she had known something that was directly relevant to my understanding of my own situation, and she had kept it because she was afraid, and her fear had mattered more to her than my right to know. I told her that I understood why she had been afraid. I told her that I had probably done the same in her position, which I was not entirely sure was true but which I said because it was possible and because I was not interested in being cruel. I told her that it changed things. Not because she had fallen in love with someone I used to love, I could, eventually, have made my peace with that. But because of 18 months of Sunday brunches with something unspoken between us, and because of a 7-minute voicemail that explained instead of asked, and because I had believed I knew her completely and I had been wrong in a way that reached back and touched everything. We did not end the friendship in that conversation. We suspended it, which is different, an indefinite pause rather than a closed door, at least on that day. I told her I needed time, and she said she understood, and both of us knew that time meant something large and uncertain and that neither of us knew what was on the other side of it. The time has been 14 months so far. In those 14 months I have thought about Cassie often and contacted her twice, once with a card on her birthday that said I was thinking of her, once with a text when I heard she had been ill, which she replied to with warmth and restraint and no pressure for more than I was offering. I do not know what we will become. I do not know if the friendship will resume in some form or if the suspension will become permanent in the way that some pauses do, not through a decision but through the accumulation of time without contact until resuming feels like starting something new rather than continuing something old. What I know is that I am not the same woman who sat in a garden church watching her ex-husband marry her best friend while managing her expression and holding her flowers. I am also not the woman who was so committed to generosity that she explained away 18 months of signals she didn't know she was receiving. I am something in between, someone who has learned to be warm and also to be paying attention, who has learned that trust is not a gift you give once but a thing you watch being honored over time, who has learned that the people who love you best are not the ones who protect you from hard conversations but the ones who have them anyway because you deserve to know. I have brunch every Sunday now with two women I have known for 3 years, women I met in the aftermath of all of this and who know the current version of me more accurately than most people know the version that came before. It is a different friendship than what I had with Cassie, less history, less of the specific shorthand that comes from decades, but also less of the weight I didn't know I was carrying. On Sunday mornings in the restaurant on Harbor Street, I drink my coffee and I tell the truth and I listen for the truth in return, and I am building something new on the only foundation that has ever held anything for very long. She was my best friend for 13 years. She sat across from me while I cried about a marriage that had already, unknown to me, begun to involve her. She asked me to stand beside her at her wedding and I did, and then I left, and then I called her, and then I began the slow and unglamorous work of deciding what I was and was not willing to carry forward into the next version of my life. What I am carrying forward is this, the knowledge that the people who deserve your full trust are the ones who have already shown you, in small and daily ways, that they can hold it carefully. Not the people who claim it. Not the people who have simply been present for a long time. The ones who have shown you, when it was difficult and when no one was watching, that your right to the truth matters more to them than their own comfort. That is not a small number of people. But it is a specific one. And I am, at 35, finally learning to know the difference.